All right, let's dive into some heady metaphysics, shall we? Today we're taking on Platonism. That whole world of abstract objects, forms, those sorts of things. And whether, like, the number three actually exists like your coffee mug does.
Well, what's so fascinating about Platonism, I think, is it grapples with these questions that have just puzzled philosophers, for centuries. And as a fellow philosopher, I know that, these questions are still very much alive today.
Oh, absolutely. And we're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Platonism in metaphysics
Mhm.
to guide us in this deep dive. It really gets to the heart of why this matters, especially for those of us, who spend our days thinking about like the nature of reality and stuff. And believe me, it gets pretty
Okay,
controversial.
for sure. We're talking about a theory that says there's this whole realm of existence that's beyond space and time. And it's populated by things like, perfect triangles, the concept of justice, maybe even like the meaning of life. Who knows?
Right. So like for those who might not have, encountered Platonism in a while or ever, can we just like break down what exactly we mean when we say something is like a Platonic form or an abstract object?
Sure. Yeah. Imagine you've got, your coffee mug right there. You've got a very concrete, specific object. But what about the property of roundness that your mug has, right? A Platonist would say that roundness isn't just like a word. It's a real thing. It's a form, and it exists independently of any particular round object.
Okay, so roundness itself is like hanging out in this realm of forms,
Yeah.
and our mug is like participating in it somehow.
Exactly. And that's just the beginning, right? We're talking numbers, properties, propositions.
Yeah.
Some philosophers even argue for fictional characters.
Wait, hold on. Fictional characters. So like Hamlet is just chilling with like the form of tragedy in this Platonic heaven.
Well, it gets complicated, I'll say that. But before we get too deep into this Platonic heaven, let's address the elephant, or rather, the lack of an elephant in the room. Because abstract objects are not in any room. The question is, do they actually, like, exist? Or are they just kind of like convenient mental tools?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Like I can talk about roundness, but if there's no roundness itself, what am I really, referring to?
Exactly. That's where the debate gets really interesting. There are some pretty compelling alternatives to Platonism, like immanent realism, for example. Immanent realism says these things exist, but they're not in some, like, separate realm. They're in the physical world.
So like redness isn't floating around out there in the abstract. It's like built into every red object, kind of.
Exactly, yeah. And then you've got conceptualism. So in conceptualism, the focus shifts to our minds, right? So redness exists as, like, a concept that we hold, not as something out there independently.
Ah, so it's all in our heads. That seems to put a lot of weight on like human thought, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And then, for the real radical folks out there, there's nominalism. And nominalism is this idea that there are no such thing as abstract objects at all. It's just language. Like, it's just our way of labeling and categorizing the world.
So like three isn't a thing, it's just a word. That seems pretty extreme even for philosophy.
Oh yeah, it definitely takes a strong stance, that's for sure. And there are even more niche views out there, like monongeism, non-factualism. But for this deep dive, let's focus on the core arguments for Platonism, specifically the ontological commitment argument. This is one of the big ones in the debate.
Okay, lay it on me. What makes this argument so compelling?
Okay, so consider the sentence: three is prime, right? You, as a philosopher, you understand truth claims. That sentence just seems undeniably true, right?
Yeah, it does. It seems like a pretty basic truth of,
Yeah.
mathematics.
Right. And it seems to be making a claim about something, the number three, right? So the argument goes, if it's true, that thing, the number three, it must exist in some sense.
I see. You can't have a true statement about something that doesn't exist at all. So the truth of that statement like commits us to believing in the existence of the thing it's about.
Exactly. And that logic goes beyond just numbers. Think about, like, what makes two red things alike? What makes them both red? Well, a Platonist would say it's because they both share in the form of redness.
So we're not just talking about like mathematical objects, but any property, like any quality that multiple things can have in common.
Yeah, precisely. And it goes even further than that. Think about, like, propositions. If you and I both believe that the sky is blue, what is it that we're both believing? It can't just be the sentence, like, in our heads, right?
Hmm.
Because people speaking different languages can believe the same thing.
So there has to be some proposition, some like abstract meaning that we're both accessing.
That's the idea. And the ontological commitment argument is saying, well, look, the truth of our beliefs, right? It kind of points to these propositions existing as real, abstract objects.
Okay, yeah. I'm starting to see, like, the power of this argument. But doesn't this lead to some pretty wild conclusions? Like, if we follow this logic all the way through, wouldn't it imply that, like, possible worlds exist, logical objects, maybe even, like, fictional characters have to exist somewhere?
That's where things get really, really interesting. And that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were starting to get into some really mind-bending stuff with this whole ontological commitment argument. Like, how far does this thing go?
Yeah, we were getting into some pretty deep waters there, pondering, possible worlds, logical objects, fictional characters. I mean, are we really saying Sherlock Holmes has some kind of concrete existence in the Platonic realm?
Right. Like, it's a fun thought experiment, but is that really what this argument is committing us to?
Well, it really depends, on which philosopher you ask and how far they're willing to push things. The point is that ontological commitment argument really makes you think carefully about, like, the consequences of your truth claims. What are you really signing up for when you say something is true?
It's like, be careful what you declare true, because you might be populating a whole realm of, like, abstract entities without even realizing it.
Exactly. But even if we set aside, those wilder implications for a minute, there's another big question that comes up when you start talking about abstract objects, especially for philosophers, like yourself. How do we know anything about these things? If they're outside of space and time, how do we even begin to grasp them?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Like,
Yeah.
if we can't interact with these abstract objects directly, how do we get any knowledge about their properties, their relationships, any of that?
That's the heart of what we call the epistemological argument against Platonism. The problem is, we humans, we seem to be stuck in this realm of the physical world, the spatiotemporal. But abstract objects, well, they're supposed to be beyond all that. So how do we bridge that gap? It seems impossible.
Yeah, it feels like a huge chasm. Like, we're used to thinking of knowledge as grounded in, experience, our senses,
Yeah.
interactions with the world around us. But Platonism seems to require a whole different kind of knowing, right?
It does, and it's led Platonists to come up with some pretty interesting solutions. One approach is to say, well, we have this special faculty. It's called intuition.
Intuition. Like a sixth sense for abstract objects.
Not quite a sixth sense, but yeah, more like a specialized cognitive capacity. It's this idea that we have a kind of built-in ability to grasp, like, certain truths, especially in math, without needing, sensory data or observation.
So, like, a direct line from our minds to the realm of forms. But how do we know those intuitions are reliable? What if they're just, like, opinions or personal beliefs?
Good point. It's easy to say we have intuition, but much harder to prove it's giving us, actual truth. And to separate it out from all the other stuff going on in our minds, that's a big challenge for Platonists. Then there's another approach, which is to say that some abstract objects, maybe, they're actually located within space-time.
Hold on, really? I thought the whole point was that abstract objects are beyond the physical.
I know it sounds a bit contradictory, but think about sets. Some philosophers argue that a set of physical objects, it actually exists wherever its members are located. So the set of all the books on your bookshelf, well, that set would be right there on your bookshelf.
Okay, I kind of see what you mean. But then wouldn't that make the set, like, dependent on the physical arrangement of the books? What if I move a book? Does the set suddenly relocate?
Yeah, that's where it gets tricky. It brings up questions about, what makes a set a set? How does it stay the same over time? If a set's just defined by where things are physically, it doesn't quite work with how we usually think about sets.
Like, we're trying to cram a square peg into a round hole or something. It feels like trying to give a specific location to something that's supposed to be, abstract just creates more problems.
I get it, yeah. There are definitely some logical knots to work out with that approach. So there's another way to think about this whole knowledge thing. Maybe instead of focusing on, like, directly seeing the forms, we focus on the logical structure of our theories.
So we're not trying to perceive abstract objects with our senses or intuition. We're, like, trying to understand them through the internal logic of our systems, right?
That
Math and logic.
Exactly. It's like the relationships we discover in those systems, they reflect the real relationships between abstract objects, even if we can't see those objects directly. We might not be able to, see the number 3, but we can understand it through how it works in arithmetic, all the axioms, the theorems, that kind of thing.
Right, I get it. But doesn't this create a new problem? How do we know if our systems are actually describing the real abstract objects? Couldn't there be multiple systems that are all logically consistent but describe different, sets of abstract objects?
That's the challenge, right? Just because a system's logically sound doesn't mean it's, a perfect map of reality. And then, of course, there's what's probably the most, shall we say, creative response to this whole knowledge problem: plenitudinous Platonism.
Oh, yeah, that's the one where things get really wild. Remind me how that one works again.
Well, plenitudinous Platonism basically says, look, all possible mathematical objects, they just exist. So
Yeah.
if you've got a theory and it's internally consistent, it must be true of something in this big, vast Platonic realm.
So every equation, every theorem, no matter how crazy or complicated, is describing some actual object somewhere out there. It's like this Platonic heaven is this giant library,
Huh.
and it has every possible math concept on the shelves.
It's a bold claim, for sure. But I think there's a certain elegance to it. It bypasses that whole problem of like direct access by saying, hey, if it's conceivable, then it exists.
Elegant, maybe, but doesn't this also raise some pretty big questions? What does it even mean for all those objects to exist? And how can our little human minds even begin to understand, concepts we can barely even wrap our heads around?
Those are great questions, and they show just how deep this whole debate goes. Plenitudinous Platonism might explain how we can have knowledge, but it opens up even bigger questions about, like, the nature of existence itself, the limits of what we can know, the whole relationship between our ideas and the world out there.
It's like every time we try to answer one question, we just end up with like 10 more.
Well, that's kind of the beauty of philosophy, isn't it? It's a constant process of questioning, refining, always pushing our understanding further. But it looks like we've reached the end of this part of our deep dive. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll continue exploring this fascinating world of Platonism.
Welcome back. It's funny. We've been talking about this Platonic heaven, this realm of abstract objects. It almost feels like we're on a philosophical playground or something.
It is a pretty wild concept when you really start to think about it. And for us, as philosophers, this isn't just an intellectual game. It really gets to the core of how we understand things like knowledge, language, even the nature of reality.
Oh, yeah. Big questions, for sure. In the last part, we were talking about plenitudinous Platonism, that idea that, like, all possible mathematical objects just exist. It's a neat way to get around the whole knowledge problem, but I don't know, it's a bit hard to wrap my head around.
It is a pretty radical idea, but think about it this way. Plenitudinous Platonism kind of shifts the focus. Instead of worrying about how we access abstract objects, we should be more concerned with making sure our theories about them are, rock solid. And that's something philosophers are already pretty good at, right? We're all about logical consistency.
Yeah, that's true. We spend a lot of time making sure our arguments, actually hold up.
Exactly. So maybe the real mystery isn't about like what's in this Platonic heaven. It's more about whether our concepts, our theories are actually describing it accurately. Like, are we drawing a good map of the territory?
So instead of asking, how can I see these abstract objects, we should be asking, how can I think about them in a really rigorous, logically sound way?
That's a great way to put it. And honestly, that might be a more productive approach than trying to find some like mystical way to directly perceive things that are outside of space and time.
Yeah, I can see how that would be more appealing to a philosopher. But even with all these like solutions and different approaches, the debate about Platonism, especially that whole knowledge problem, I mean, it's not really over, right?
Oh, absolutely not. Philosophers are still arguing about what abstract objects are, how they relate to the physical world, all that stuff. Can our limited minds even begin to grasp the infinite?
Which honestly is part of what makes philosophy so much fun, right? There's
Yeah.
always more to discover, more to debate, more to think about.
I agree. And this deep dive, hopefully it's giving you some more tools to engage with those debates. We started with the basics. What are these forms, these abstract objects? Then we look at the arguments for and against their existence.
We even got into the weeds with that whole knowledge problem. How can we know anything about a realm that's beyond our direct experience?
We journeyed through possible worlds, tried to pin down the location of sets, even entertained the idea that every math equation is describing, some real object somewhere out there.
It's been a wild ride.
It has. But through it all, we kept coming back to those fundamental questions of metaphysics and epistemology. What's real? How do we know? How can we, as physical beings, even try to understand something that's abstract and infinite?
Big questions that philosophers have been asking for, like, centuries.
And we'll probably keep asking for centuries more. But here's one final thought to leave you with. What if the truth about these abstract objects, it's not all or nothing? What if some of them exist, but some don't? How would we figure out which ones are real and which ones are just, concepts we've made up?
That's a great question. It makes us think not just about whether they exist, but like, what does it even mean to exist in this weird abstract realm?
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder that philosophical puzzle. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into those mysteries of existence.